In this video, we're going to cover the following topics. Number 1, prerequisites to perform IP phone firmware migration from MPP, also known as 3PCC, to enterprise firmware with classic licensing using a local Tftp server. Number 2, workflow demonstration of performing the firmware migration from MPP to enterprise using a local Tftp server. And then the last item will be troubleshooting considerations. In effort to be able to perform a firmware migration from MPP to enterprise, licensing needs to be purchased for each phone. There's two different licensing options. There's non-flex licensing, and there's also flex licensing. In this video, I'm going to be using the non-flex licensing, and there's two different options for the non-flex licensing. If we have an 8800 series phone, then we want to purchase the L-CP-M2E-88XX-CNV equal symbol. If we have the 7800 series phones, then the licensing to be purchased would be L-CP-M2E-7800-CNV equal symbol. The flex licensing is based upon a subscription. This is something I do not have, but in your case, if you have a subscription, then this is something you'd want to leverage. What we're going to be doing basically is we're going to be placing the physical licensing on the local Tftp server. We'll take a look at this in a few moments. We do need to have a license for each phone. So each phone that we're going to be doing a firmware migration does require a migration license. The license is actually tied to the phone's MAC address. And there's actually a very good document that goes over the firmware migration steps and also any type of caveats that may be involved with the firmware migration process. The link at the bottom here is a white paper. It does get updated from time to time. It would be highly recommended if you're going to be doing a project where it involves phone firmware migration that you actually take a look at this document and just be prepared for understanding what the workflow is, the licensing, and any other caveats that may be tied to the project. One key area is if you do run into issues, what tech support or which tech support do you need to contact? And there's three main different tech supports regarding the firmware migration if you run into issues. So the first tech support is if you're doing the actual flex licensing and you're having entitlement issues of getting the licensing, then you'd want to go ahead and contact the Cisco entitlements team, and basically this would be the URL right here. The next one would be if you're purchasing the actual licensing, so the non-flex licensing, and you're having issues related to getting the licensing via email, or there's other types of issues or questions you have regarding the licensing. So you would want to contact the Cisco Global Licensing team, and they can be contacted at this URL right here. And then the last team would be if you're having issues with the physical phones, and that would be the small business support team. So for example, let's say you're having issues, the phone is not getting a Dhcp IP address, you're having issues, the phone is not attaching to the proper VLAN, etc., etc. Another example would be how to reset the phone to factory default. In any case, this would be the URL for the small business tech support team right here. And then the last item on this page, which is very critical, and I'll read this verbatim. So the question says, my customer purchased the wrong phone type and needs to migrate the phone to the call controller they have. Can we do this? The answer is no. Please contact point of sale to return the phones and order the proper phones for the customer. Cisco will not replace the phones or migrate phones for customers that make a mistake when ordering the phones. The other item to be aware is not all the phones might be eligible as far as hardware goes for the firmware migration. So there's a chart published, same URL we looked at a few moments ago, the white paper for the firmware migration. And there's going to be a chart or a table published as far as which phones are eligible from MPP to enterprise firmware migration. So this is something you definitely want to take a look at to ensure that the physical hardware phones you have are eligible for the firmware migration. Okay, next thing we're going to take a look at is what do we need to set up from a TFTP server standpoint. So it's going to be fairly straightforward. We're going to basically create a folder on our TFTP server, and the folder is going to really contain two main items. It's going to contain the license file that's required for the firmware migration from 3PCC to enterprise, and the license file is going to actually be tied to the MAC address of the phone, so you can see that's the MAC address of my phone. The other item is going to be actually the enterprise firmware, and this is unzipped. So the key file here in the enterprise firmware is going to be this file that ends with .loads, because this will be the actual file in a few moments we're going to point to from the phone itself, and it's going to tell the phone what other binaries, basically these are assigned binaries, that the phone needs to ingest for the firmware migration to occur. So again, pretty simple setup here. We have a folder. We've downloaded the appropriate binaries for our phone. In this case, it's the 8832 speakerphone, aka conference room phone. I've unzipped everything into this folder. I've also purchased the proper license for the firmware migration from 3PCC to enterprise firmware for my 8832 phone. And I've also placed this in this folder. And now the TFTP server is pointing to this folder as the root folder, and we'll take a look at that in a moment here. So the TFTP server is pointing to the folder as a root folder, and in this example we're using TFTPD64. So basically I click the browse button, and then I basically went to the folder that we looked at here a few moments ago. And basically that's what we have here where it says current directory. Then this is the IP address that the PC has that's acting as a TFTP server. And as we talked earlier, the two key items here is basically the appropriate enterprise firmware for the phone we're going to be migrating from 3PCC to enterprise. In this case, the actual model is going to be the speakerphone 8832. And the key file here actually that I mentioned a moment ago is going to be the file that ends with a .loads, because this is actually in the GUI of the 8832 phone what we're going to be pointing to. And what this does basically is once the phone ingests this file, and it also concurrently needs to ingest this for the authorization, the license key, and it passes the authorization part that it's been licensed properly, etc., etc., then the .loads file basically instructs the phone to download all the needed signed binaries, which you see kind of listed above here. And once it completes that, basically the phone will reboot and it'll be running the enterprise firmware. Some of the things to note is a firmware migration license is needed for each phone that will be migrated from 3PCC to enterprise. So be aware that if you have one phone, one license is needed to be purchased. If you have 10 phones, 10 licenses need to be purchased. Also, the other thing to be aware of is when you purchased a migration license from 3PCC to Enterprise, there will be instructions that will be included in email that you get. And what basically needs to be done is the instructions will tell you how to take the pack, which is actually once you purchase the licensing, it'll have a pack number, and it'll tell you how to attach that to the MAC address of your phone. And when you combine these two, then what you're going to end up having is it's going to generate the needed firmware migration license that's specifically tied to the MAC address of your phone. In any case, instructions for this process will be in an email. This is something that you definitely need to go through before attempting the firmware migration. And we've already talked about that within the TFTP folder, the enterprise firmware and the license file need to be located, and that's kind of what we looked at above here. And then obviously for the different phones, there's different binaries. So that's another thing. Take a look at the different phones you're performing the firmware migration and download the appropriate binaries for those phones, as it may differ depending on the model. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and log into the phone itself. So this is the web GUI of the 8832 phone. And when you first hit the web GUI of the 8832 phone, what you want to do is you want to look at the right-hand side here on the phone. So typically there'll be a item here that says user admin. In this case it says user login because I already clicked on that earlier and I'm already in admin mode. And then the second item you want to click on is going to be advanced. So you should end up with a URL which will be the IP address of the phone /admin/advanced. The reason that's critical, that unless we're in admin advanced mode, not all the information will be presented in the screen, and you will run into some issues doing this process. So in any case, now that we're in admin advanced mode, we're going to click on Voice tab at the top. Then we're going to click on the Provisioning tab right below here, and then we're going to basically scroll down this page until we get to a section that says Firmware Upgrade. And then here what we're interested in is the upgrade role and also the transition authorization role. And basically what this is telling the phone on the first item, the upgrade role, is we're going to go in and fetch the binaries using TFTP protocol. Where's the server at? Okay, / / 192.168.2.50. And then / what is the actual binary name of the downloads file? If you recall earlier, I said the downloads file is a critical file that we're going to leverage in a few moments. That tells the phone which binaries it needs to fetch from that folder on the TFTP server. And then the next item that's also very critical is going to be the transition authorization role. Again, we're using TFTP protocol / / IP address of our TFTP server 192.168.2.50 / and then the license file for the phone that we're doing the firmware migration from 3PCC to Enterprise. And again, this is actually the MAC address of our phone. The other item also that I would like to point out is going to be the transition authorization type. It is set to Classic, and that should be the default. The other item also that I have not mentioned to be aware of is we're using version 11.3.5. This process with earlier versions of firmware would not be a one-step process in a case that we're basically just setting up a TFTP folder, we're getting the needed binaries and a license, and we're just basically, as we've seen here in the menu, pointing to the TFTP server, the proper binary, the downloads binary file, and then a proper license. And then basically we're going to, at the very bottom here, we're going to click on Submit All Changes. So there'll be this button right here that is kind of hidden, but in any case, that'll be step number 4. And then it's going to start the firmware migration process. If you're using older firmware, pre-11.3.5, this would be a two-step process. You basically would have to go ahead and download something called the transitional firmware, get the phone migrate over to a transitional firmware, kind of using the same methodology. And then once it's migrated to transitional firmware, then you would basically set up another subdirectory in your Tftp server. Kind of what we did right here in a sense. We have the proper enterprise binaries downloaded for the phone. We have the license for the phone for the firmware migration. And then we would basically do exactly what we're doing here from the transitional firmware over to the enterprise firmware. But just be aware, what I'm showing here assumes that you have firmware version 11.3.5 or higher. Okay, now that we've applied those settings, if you notice that the actual phone has started to fetch the binaries from the actual Tftp server, this process typically takes a little bit more than 5 minutes. So it's not too long, but just be aware you should see activity right off the bat. If there's nothing occurring, then you definitely want to take a look and see, can the actual PC ping the phone? Is there any, if it cannot ping the phone, check to make sure there's no Microsoft or third-party security/firewalls running on a computer. Make sure the phone, if it's Dhcp, it's getting a Dhcp IP address, etc., etc. Okay, and then towards the end of this process, you will get a message on the phone that says firmware migration upgrade in progress. And again, after about 5+ minutes roughly, it will complete, it'll reboot. Once it reboots, you want to go into the phone's TUI, telephony user interface, basically the LCD. You want to go under System Information, which is option number 12. And then we want to look at basically two items. We want to make sure the model number does not have any 3PCC at the end of the name here, which it does not. Then we scroll down this window here a little bit, and we'll have what is called active load. And here we want to take a look at the load to make sure it's an enterprise firmware. In this case, it is the 12-8-1 is enterprise. And the other tip off here would be that with the 3PCC firmware, it would actually have MPP somewhere in the firmware name. This does not, so it just says SIP 8832. And then this is part of the enterprise train, and there's no MPP name. So that kind of gives us illustration of what it looks like. Next, we'll actually see on the phone itself what the process looks like. Okay, next we're going to take a look at the actual phone itself before we perform the firmware migration from 3PCC to enterprise. We're going to go down here towards status and then product information. Okay, we notice the phone is a 3PCC 8832, and also we notice that the actual software version in the name has MPP. So notice it's 11-3-5 MPP. Okay, we're on the PC right now that's acting as the Tftp server. We have the needed folder with the license file with the proper 8832 enterprise firmware binaries unzipped within the same folder as the license file. And then we also have the Tftp server pointing to the folder as a root folder. We're going to take a look at the phone, what it currently has before we do the firm migration. Notice it's a 3PCC phone 8832. And then also notice that the MPP in the name of the software load. Okay, we're going to go up to Voice tab, Provisioning tab. We're going to go in and scroll down the Page a tad. Okay, we're going to go ahead and take the information we need for the upgrade rule. So this is going to tell the phone where it needs to fetch the binaries. The next information is going to be for the authorization rule, where it's going to find the actual license file. So right now we have both of these set up correctly. And the next item we're going to do is we're going to click Submit All Changes. Okay, the phone has started to download the binaries. This process is going to take approximately a little bit more than 5 minutes. Once you apply all changes, once you click on the Apply All Changes button, if you don't see any activities very shortly within the next few seconds, typically that will indicate something has gone wrong. Make sure you can ping the phone from the Tftp server. In this case, the PC we're using for the configuration of the phone and also for the TFTP function is one of the same. So obviously in this case the phone is reachable. Also make sure the PC is not running any type of firewall or third-party security software. So example, Microsoft firewall, make sure temporarily that's disabled if that's interfering with the TFTP transfers. Likewise, if there's any third-party security software, temporarily disable it if it's interfering with the TFTP transfers. TFTP is clear text, so if you are running into any type of issue, you can actually use Wireshark and take a look at the TFTP packets, specifically in the payload of the packets. And what you'll see is, one, you should be seeing packets from the phone trying to get specific files. And if it's having issues, check and see what kind of error message the TFTP server is giving. If the TFTP server is not giving any messages, make sure that it's ingesting the actual TFTP packets. So Wireshark typically works very good for this. This process, as I mentioned, is going to take about 5 minutes, so it's fairly quick. It's not that long. And then when the phone finishes digesting all of the binaries, it's going to go ahead and reboot itself. So one thing to note is one of the first things the phone does when we started this process, it downloads or ingests the .loads file and concurrently does also the .lick file. And it does a validation check to check if the licensing is proper for the phone to be authorized to perform the firmware migration. So just be aware that if you're not getting past the first like 2 files, you probably want to look at the phone itself. Under the debug tab, there's like a messages section, and check and see what the log messages on the phone are indicating. The actual license file you do not want to tamper with. The license file is very specific to a single phone. So when you get the pack, when you purchase a licensing and you get the pack information, you take that information, you combine it with the MAC address. The email that you're going to get does actually give you the instructions on the process. And combination of the MAC address of the phone with the pack information is what generates the actual .lick or .license file. So that's something, be aware if you're stuck on that end of things, check to make sure the model of phone that you're trying to migrate is proper. Make sure that model phone is eligible for firmware migration, and make sure the MAC address matches to what was actually entered in when the license file was being generated. Okay, we're now looking at the actual 8832 phone. Okay, the phone is indicating firmware upgrade in progress. Okay, the phone went ahead and rebooted. Typically the reboot will last about 1.5 minutes roughly. You may see some variance of plus or minus 30 seconds on average. Once the phone finishes up the boot cycle, we want to go into the phone and validate that the firmware upgrade, or excuse me, the firmware migration has properly occurred. So that's one of the things we'll take a look at here in a few moments when the phone actually finishes the boot up cycle. Okay. The phone is going into runtime. Okay. At this point of time, the phone is in a state that we can actually go into the settings and take a look at it. I do have this phone in an isolated environment, so no provisioning is going to happen. There's no CUCM, if you will. So we'll go into settings. Then we're going to go down to the system information, which is option 2. We're going to look at the model. Notice there's no 3PCC in the model name. It just says CP8832. We'll go down to the actual section that it shows active load. And notice within the active load there's no MPP. It just says CIP8832. And then it has the version of the enterprise version that's running, 12-8-1. So we look in good shape at this point of time. Okay, the last item we want to look at here is with the newer versions of TFTPD64 and or TFTPD32, the software actually has added an option for Dhcp, and Dhcp is on by default. So in most cases, you most likely already have Dhcp on your network, and you probably would want to disable Dhcp. In this case, actually, I am leveraging the Dhcp that's built into the TFTP64 since I have this on an isolated VLAN/switch, if you will. But in most cases, you'll probably have this in a production environment or lab environment where there's a pre-existing Dhcp server. So you probably want to go ahead and disable the Dhcp function right off the bat so you don't have conflicts, Dhcp conflicts occurring. The other items that are enabled is, for example, syslog is enabled. You can disable it. It's not going to be used for what we're doing here. So, you know, and then the other one is TFTP client. We're not using TFTP client. We are using TFTP server. So the only one you really need is TFTP server. Okay. If you're going to use this as a Dhcp server, maybe it's an isolated VLAN or isolated switch, if you will, kind of what I'm doing here, then this is very easy to use. Basically, just define the IP pool start address. In my case, it's 192.168.2.100. And then the next item is going to be size of pool. I just put 20. Next item is going to be the lease in minutes. Default is 2,880 minutes. Default router 192.168.2.1, which is the actual IP address of the VLAN on my switch, the switch virtual interface, if you will. And then basically the mask 255.255.255.0, and that's basically it. Hopefully this video has helped you with the firmware migration using classic licenses from 3PCC over to enterprise firmware. Thank you for watching the video, and hopefully your firmware migration process goes smoothly. Thank you. Bye.